this is a different kind of beauty. Nothing like the 600i. In fact, I would say perhaps even the opposite. Hey guys, I'm Morphologist, and in this video of An Architect Reviews, I'm going to be using my skill set as an architectural designer to take a look at the Constellation series by RSI. Now, this review has presented somewhat of a challenge for me. You see, the Constellation series, unlike the 600i, were designed for utility, not for luxury or visual beauty. And so, picking out the issues with it are at first not very apparent until you take a closer look. And so the way I shall rate the success of the Constellation shall be completely based upon how successful is it as it relates to the functions stated by RSI. So, without further ado, let's get started. Excluding special edition versions, there are 4 different variants of the Constellation currently available. The Aquila, which is the exploration version, the Andromeda, which is the militia gunboat version, then you have the Phoenix, which is the luxury version, and finally, the Taurus, which is just for hauling. Now, I know it might be a little confusing, but the ships in the background are just the Andromeda and the Aquila because the other ships have not yet been released to the live servers of Star Citizen. Luckily, for this review, it really doesn't matter because the Andromeda and the Aquila only have very minor differences in terms of paint jobs, loadout, and the front canopy being really the most noticeable difference. So for the sake of sanity, we're going to be taking a look at the Aquila's interior only. Now, I know some of you understand that the Phoenix is going to be very different as it's going to be the luxury version. Well, don't worry, we'll come back and give that ship a special review. So let's begin on the bridge of the Aquila. Now, one of the really exciting things about the Constellation is just how different the design language is from all other ships. The interior is very angular, with very few parallel lines. Everything is very exposed, the connections of the panels, the way the seats are connected to the floor, and it all just gives me a sense that things were actually thought out in the way that they were put together and assembled. It gives a bit more reality and weight, I feel, to the design of the interior of the Constellation series. Now, since we're here at the front, the canopy really is, for me, one of the biggest issues in this part of the ship. The visibility is really hampered by those front 2 bars, which sit directly in your line of sight. Now, I understand that there's some structural design idea behind this to designate it as an RSI ship over others, but I think there's a lot more design language in the Constellation series that separates it from other ships that this isn't really necessary. Definitely think there's a way to design it where the struts are still there, but they're not directly in the way. I believe this is a case where design language kind of gets in the way of functionality, and that's where I draw the line. Once design starts hampering the user's experience negatively, then it's no longer successful design. Oh, and the Andromeda? Well, it's actually a bit worse. So, if the Constellation series is ever reworked, I definitely think the canopy should be at the top of that list. Now let's move to the midsection of the Constellation, where we can see one of the more unique aspects of these series of ships. In all variants, there's a bottom and top turret of varying functionality. Quite like the way that you access them, it's very user-friendly and easy to understand. And one of the good things I think about the Aquila design is that they decided to replace the top turret with a directional sensor package that allows people to scan down planets and possibly also scan down cloaked targets. If you think about the programmatic use of the Aquila as an exploration vessel, it makes a lot of sense. But there are definitely elements of the Aquila that definitely don't make sense, and we're going to come back to that later. One of the things I really love about the design of the turrets on the Constellation series, though, is that there are doors that cover them when they're not in use. This makes a lot of sense because it protects them from oncoming fire in the case that you were not prepared for an engagement. Additionally, it allows a way for you to seal off the ship in the unfortunate event that one of the turrets is blown off, which unfortunately does happen. Now we're in the bottom turret, and this is where we start seeing some problems. I have no idea why they elected to make the turret mounted in this fashion. It's not aircraft. It's a spaceship, and there's no up and down in space. I'd be much better served flipped the other way around so that I can actually see targets that may be below us in the case of the ship. Now, below is, again, relative, but that would be underneath my current seating position. As you can see, The guns actually do not rotate down directly below the turret, which means that if somebody flies directly below me, I can't actually engage them, let alone see them. So let's hope that this is one of the things that they reconsider in the next iteration of the Constellation series. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we move on to the midsection of the ship is a really strange design choice on the floor of the bridge. If you look, there's a gigantic electrical cable running directly over the floor plates to the other side of the ship. Now, this looks to me to be a gigantic tripping hazard, and it could just as easily have been put underneath the floor. Now, I understand that this was put here because it looks cool, but I think, again, there's a limit to looking cool when it starts to impede on functionality, and this is definitely one of those cases. But now, let's move on to the midsection of the Constellation. We now find ourselves in the living section of the Constellation, and to me, I think it has one of the more creative solutions to a problem in the Constellation, and that's how do you access the exterior without decompressing the interior? Well, the way they've done it here is allowing the lift to lower midway to close the doors and then open the bottom. This in effect creates a compact version of an airlock and has the added bonus of preventing you from accidentally killing your crewmates by boiling their blood inside of their bodies. Yeah, not a pretty sight. The other things I find to be very successful aside from the lift is the consistency of language. Just as it was on the bridge, in the back here everything is laid bare for me to see. There are exposed screws and panels and everything looks like it has a function, even if it doesn't. If I pulled out a module there, a wire here, things probably would stop working, and that gives the atmosphere of the ship real weight. I also really appreciate the consistency of the idea of utility. Here in the back you can see the table folds away so that you have an increased amount of space. It really fits with the idea that this ship is really meant to serve a purpose. It's not about luxury, it's about making sure you can get the job done. Here the shower is very consistent with that idea. It's very tiny, it doesn't look like it would be terribly comfortable, but it serves its function, and serves as a great place to hide the droids in case the Empire comes looking. Ha ha ha. Anyway, one of the other very successful components of the Constellation series are the sleeping quarters. At first glance, it looks like a regular bunk bed, but if you look closer, you'll notice that there's a white panel on the inside of them. Those are actually life support systems because these double as escape pods. Now that is efficiency of design. Now, while they're not as comfortable as, say, the 600i sleeping quarters, they do allow for a bit more privacy with roll-down doors. And just in case you're wondering how they're ejected from the exterior of the ship, well, if you go outside and you look, directly above and below the beds, there are doors that are supposed to blow off in the case of an emergency. Kudos to the designers for their attention to detail. Something that you'll also appreciate here in the rear section of the Constellation. There's a lot to process here in the cargo area of the Constellation because there's just so much detail. The lighting, the texture choice, the positioning of spaces is all very dramatic and wonderfully thought through. But what I'd like to call attention to is the size of the cargo area. It is somewhat of an issue. Getting the Ursa rover up onto the ramp is easy enough. The issue becomes apparent though when you try to close the door with the Ursa rover on it. Although it fits and you can get to the panel, you're very close to being crushed by the Ursa if it were to shift position. This to me just seems like a very dangerous design, and they should definitely consider widening the ramp just slightly to allow for a bit more safe access to the lift panel. When the injury mechanics are implemented into Star Citizen, I can imagine a lot of people having their legs broken because of this design flaw. But all of this section is definitely not flawed. This area up here, the catwalk that goes around the cargo area, is certainly really cool to walk through. And you can really appreciate the designer's attention to detail where you can see the missiles before they're loaded into the launcher on the roof. Now that is just plain cool. Now the ship doesn't have an engineering section like the 600i. It's actually dispersed throughout the entire ship. Here you'll see on the right avionics panels, and across you'll see shield generator panels. Those of you really paying attention may have noticed that there have been other panels in the ship that we've seen that have been labeled identically to this, and there is a very good reason for that. In architecture, we call this resilient design, and it's even more important in a spaceship. Say if, for example, one of the generators, the avionics, or the life support fails, you've got a backup redundant system that can keep you going until you get repaired. Definitely more of a concern in the vacuum of space than it would be on a planetary surface. Finally, we've reached the rear section of the Constellation, and it's here I'd like to point out some extreme design flaws that I believe the ship has. While I can appreciate the novelty of having a snub-nosed fighter docked to the back of my ship, I find its effectiveness somewhat dubious, especially considering in the case of the Aquila, I don't have additional storage if I have an Ursa rover in my cargo bay. Where am I storing my extra food? Where am I storing my extra supplies? How about if I get injured? Where am I going to fix myself up without a medical bay? All of these are very important considerations when you're thinking about an exploration vessel. The fact that neither this nor the 600i have medical facilities is extremely concerning. And I would highly encourage the designers to go back and think about how this rear space could be used more effectively. In conclusion, I really appreciate the design aesthetic and language of the Constellation series. Its utilitarian and purpose-inspired design is wonderful and consistent throughout the entire ship, with the exception of the few things that I have noted. And it's for this reason that I actually prefer the design of the Constellation over the 600i. It has so much more weight and purpose to it, and for that reason, it's my favorite ship. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you like the RSI Constellation series? Do you dislike it? Or do you agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video? Let me know down in the comment section below. And if you liked the video, if you'd like to see more, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to get into Star Citizen, be sure you check the comment section below to join my community, where you can join me in later videos to find my special reference code, which will give you 5,000 UEC when you make a pledge to get into Star Citizen. Anyway guys, I hope you liked the video, and I hope to see you guys around the verse.